My name is Julia Kloiber. I'm from Ashoka, and I'm super happy to welcome Shandor Lederer and Apar Gupta to this session. Shandor is from an organization called K-Monitor, a Hungarian nonprofit that works on technology and research to unveil corruption. And Apar is joining us from India. He leads the Internet Freedom Foundation, an Indian digital liberties organization that seeks to ensure that technology respects fundamental rights. Before we dive into our discussion, I want to briefly give you some context on the topic and why I chose this topic for the session. A couple of months ago, I joined a workshop where we, together with human rights lawyers, with campaigners, with activists, brainstormed or speculated about the future of digital rights, and we developed a universal declaration of digital rights. Some rights that we came up with were the right to bodily integrity, the right to disconnect, the right to participate in government participation without being online, so offline participation, so a full array of rights. And I wanted to continue this conversation here with our two panelists, because a lot of times when we're working in the civil society sector, we are very much in the here and now. We have limited resources, time constraints, we're driven by someone else's agenda, we are fighting against surveillance for net neutrality, but we have very little time to envision what the future might look like when our fields thrive and when we have like all those rights we envision. This is why sometimes it's good to take a step back and to take some time to envision this future that can help to make some topics more tangible and to unite communities behind your cause. And today in this session, I want us to better understand what our panelists are working on, to learn what they see as the most important topics in their fields, and to talk about the visions of the future we have. And I want to invite everyone from the audience to send us their questions via the chat in Swapcard. We will come to your questions and are happy to have some involvement by the audience. To kick us off, I decided it makes sense to get to know Shandor and Apar a little better by asking them the question what their first memory of the internet is. So Shandor, what was the first memory that you have of the internet, and how is the internet today different from back then?
I think the first memory is the sound of the modem we had, which, you know, when you were connecting, that was a very specific sound that I remember, and that the whole family had one email address. And for me, it was the email that was the first, you know, internet thing, not the content on the internet. And the whole family had one internet and one email account. So we always read each other's emails and were telling each other, you got a mail from this or that person. But when I also started browsing, what fascinated me, or what I remember this feeling that, you know, information is endless out there. It's maybe only the bandwidth that can limit you from, you know, accessing a lot of stuff. So I was just fascinated that the world opens up, and you don't need to go to a library or buy a newspaper or switch on the radio to learn about the world.
And did this change? Like, where do you see changes from like back then to like the internet now? You of course have your own email address now. It's not a shared email address anymore. But aside this, like access to information, how has that maybe changed?
I mean, it became part of our life. I think I spent maybe more time online than offline, with all the advantages and disadvantages of that. I think I was looking forward to this change in a sense that, you know, it enables a lot of, you know, stuff needed for democratic renewal, for freedom of speech, generally access to information, and many of that is, you know, basic or became basic, or we have a very different understanding of, you know, what we can do. On the other hand, I think our privacy suffered a lot. So if you just think of, you have not a single second in your life which is not tracked in one way or the other. That's also quite scary. And the way how this is then processed and how that influences your life, that makes me scary, and probably that wasn't there back in those days.
Thanks. Apar, over to you. What was the internet like in India when you were growing up, or what was your first memory of the internet?
So similar to Sandor. So I remember the sound of the modem. I remember how the modems were replaced one after the other. They were very expensive devices, and each incremental speed upgrade meant the internet changed. So just in terms of the medium and the speed itself, what it enabled was a video sharing website, which all of a sudden just became possible. And I remember refreshing the page quite often. Emotionally, my response to it was for many people who were introverted at early points in, like, if you're a shy kid, it really opens up that door of discovery for you, and it allows you to a space to explore your personality. You can read more, and you can go beyond your neighborhood, your immediate set of peers. And what has changed, I guess, is that the internet has become a bit more noisy, but it's also become much more centralized. So a core part of our time used to be my time used to be spent around search engines and discovering individual blogs or writing them. And I guess we didn't have aggregated feeds, which are there on social networking platforms. And this allowed a sense of discovery and individual curation, which I think has gone away. And we also, in addition to this problem about privacy, we have this incredible issue of distraction and floods of information, which are sometimes a form of censorship, where the dominant flood of information sometimes overpowers individual thought.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sometimes wondering what it must feel like to learn about the internet right now, to grow up with the internet now, versus to back in the day when we grew up with the internet and when it grew kind of with us somehow. Sándor, I already mentioned that you're working on fighting corruption in Hungary. Why don't you tell us more about your work and your organization? What are topics that you're currently working on? What are tools that you've been working on in the past? And maybe also what are rights that are important for your work and the work of your organization?
Yeah, so K-Monitor, as you said, is a anti-corruption and pro-transparency organization, and our angle to technology comes from finding that it is a very important tool to actually both fight corruption and make governance more transparent, and also allow to citizens to participate in decision making, which we find a very important antidote to corruption. And the organization started with building a huge database of corruption cases and cases of public spending in Hungary, which we then put also on the map so people could connect cases to places they know from their everyday lives, so where they pass. And most of the things we do, which is connected to digital rights and the digital agenda, is of course connected to transparency. One issue we're working on now under the leadership and coordination of the Państwo Foundation in Poland and with many other organizations from the region is on the transparency of algorithms used by the government. The project is called Algorithms. And here the idea is that we know so little about. We started to explore, how in what fields and how extensively are algorithms used by government bodies, and how is it regulated. And we found out that they already use algorithms, but they're even often unaware that this is an algorithm, and there's absolutely no clue how they set up, whether they were developed internally or by an outsourced company or outsourced to a company who owns the code, did anybody do security checks, privacy checks, legal checks, whether the procession of data is fine. So I mean, it's absolutely unexplored here in the region, and it's getting a bigger and bigger trend to use that. So this is definitely one interesting topic for us. Another issue is access to big databases owned by the state, which now are in a shape that they could be really easily made accessible to the public, but there is secrecy around. I would say just company registry data, data on public procurements, land ownership, things like that. The government is investing a lot of money in digitizing public administration, but they limit access to information. So there's not a similar development. Even worse, there is a backdrop in access to information. And maybe a third issue which connects to the privacy field and the digital field as well is, you know, when you work with corruption, it's always the control of power. And in these days, often it's not governments that have the biggest power, but tech companies. Let's say, you know, Facebook or Google have a often much bigger impact on our life than, you know, our own government. So our interest towards holding these companies and these platforms accountable is also there. And one topic where it really connects with public spending is, let's say, access to advertising on these platforms, especially when it's political ads, but generally how ads influence your decisions and actions. And then you go on to topics like how algorithms on these platforms influence what you see and whether they limit freedom of speech or whether, you know, they give access to hate speech. So it's quite a complex thing, which, you know, interferes very much with our anti-corruption and transparency agenda.
Nice, thanks for the overview. Maybe one question about the access to what algorithms the government is using. Are freedom of information laws like getting you any further, or are they too restrictive or do not touch upon the algorithms topic?
I would say they would, or you can absolutely interpret them in a way that they would help you. The problem is really that those algorithms are often not considered as technology or data as you would assume, you know, a public procurement contract. But let's say the agency doesn't even have the code when I'm asking, you know, give me the code, or either they say, you know, it's protected by copyright, so I cannot share it with you, or we don't have it at all because it's at the company that, you know, runs that platform. So you have other issues that come up, and there, you know, regulation is needed. But I think the concept of freedom of information as such would cover it, and I think we need to do a lot of strategic litigation here to, you know, make this breakthrough.
Thank you. Apart, do some of the topics you've been hearing like resonate with you? What is the Internet Freedom Foundation working on right now? Because there's always this big array of topics, but what are your main priorities in India right now? You're on mute.
Yeah, so our main priorities in India essentially also just come from the constitutional promises of a country which gained independence and has had about 25 years of the internet. And when our constitution was conceptualized, we kind of thought about a welfare state where people have a high degree of individual liberty, and there also is a big degree of emphasis on social justice, because India is a very unequal society. I got access to the internet early, but a lot of people in my country don't have access to the internet, and their human development is lagging behind. So access is one area we're working on, and that kind of complements and visits itself in terms of what is the type of access also, or does it just mean 2G access? So we try to ensure that the argument that access to the internet is a fundamental right is firstly accepted through strategic litigation. We've been able to achieve some success there, but then even take it forward in terms of governance agenda goals. We advocate for that. Disruptions don't take place. So for instance, the ongoing internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir, or constituencies in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which has a great beach and people go there, but it has no 4G internet. So to ensure that the rollout is in such a way, especially in times of COVID, where people need to do remote work, telemedicine, so many services. So that's one vertical of work we work on. The second is on censorship again, but we've integrated some bits of that with access, and also that conception of power, which Sandor was talking about a bit, where we do, and there's this recurring reference to the panopticon centralization of power. We notice that in India quite a lot because we have a biometric citizen ID, which links to a whole host of government databases, but also private services such as mobile phones, bank records. Essentially, does India have a good data protection law? And we don't have it yet. Do we have surveillance reform? We don't have it yet. So we work a lot on those areas of work as well. All of this is public centered. So our advocacy, quite often when it targets institutions, centers it in a level of digital literacy, of explaining it through videos, comics, illustrations, integrating art with it, making it enjoyable and positive for people to understand really complex debates and hopefully bridge the divide between the public policy experts and the public itself, at least to those constituencies which may be literate, have access to the internet, and can support them. So go beyond the lawyers is something we keep saying. And as a recovering lawyer, I fully endorse that.
We talked about transparency before with Shandor, and you just mentioned Aadhaar, the biggest biometric database any country holds in the world. Do people have access? Is there transparency on what data the government holds and whom they are sharing the data with?
So there is a degree of transparency on what data the government holds, but it's adopting the transparency requirement much more recently in a bit of a problematic way. So Sandor was talking about in terms of transparency of company registrations, core data points, etc. The government of India does like publishing it, but it likes to control how that information is then analyzed. And what we've noticed is in terms of recent trends, the focus is on making the individual more transparent and the state more secretive. So again, it plays into that larger framework of power theoretically, where the people are more vulnerable and the state is much less accountable for the decisions that it takes. But just in terms of a contact tracing app, for instance, and proximity notification app called Arogya Setu, there was a large demand for it to be open source. And after there were online campaigns in which we contributed, the government did make it open source. It doesn't update the build version. There are controversies. The server-side code is not there. But in principle, the government finds it incredibly tough in terms of resisting demands for transparency because they cut across the political spectrum. So as much as things do seem fairly challenging, I would say that the government does put out information. Transparency at a certain level is inhibited by it. They challenge it, but usually you are able to prevail. It is contentious though.
Great. And I mean, we've already discussed many topics that could lead us down very dystopian roads if there's no improvement. Before I switch to the more optimistic part, I want to take a question from the audience. So Albert Khan asks, what best practices and regulatory frameworks do you draw on in regulating public sector use of automated decision systems, including algorithmic systems? More specifically, are there any good models for leveraging freedom of information laws to evaluate deep learning and other black box systems? These would appear to pose unprecedented challenges since governments wouldn't really be able to hand over the algorithm. Who wants to answer that question or share some thoughts around it?
So just a very practical deployment is when you use the biometric system for provision of rations for people who are underprivileged, and these are food rations. There's a duty on the state to do it. But if your biometric fingerprint does not match from the time of enrollment to the time of authentication, and biometrics change. And biometrics also go through a level of variance. So if the algorithm having a transparency, having an accuracy meter setting, which is adjusted towards these kind of adjustments, what has been our experience in India has been that it's fairly difficult. For instance, just the Zoom call, we are so sophisticated and it took us time to set this up, right? But what happens to a poor person who's not able to negotiate it to that level of technicality? So I come at it a little differently, and I may sound like a Luddite, but if the impact on harm and on people is extremely severe through automated decision-making algorithms, I think it outweighs the efficiency. So, which it provides in terms of cost savings, or in terms of ensuring that there's a reduction in corruption, etc. There are other ways to address that as well. So I'll just leave that thought in terms of, there are also other models, transparency, human reviews, etc. But I would question the basis of integrating automated decision-making when the impacts are incredibly severe for disadvantaged groups.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are many models to make the use of algorithms and make the use of automatic decision making more accountable and transparent. You can set up bodies that have such a duty. I mean, the whole infrastructure for controlling that is very underdeveloped. A lot of legislation, ethical norms are missing in national framework. I think that the issue of transparency is a serious problem. There's no impact assessment done that is again then made transparent, so you could see, and I think again with especially vulnerable groups or those who have personally no chances to really file appeals if an automated decision is hurts their rights or their interests. So platforms are needed where you can, let's say, appeal to a decision by an algorithm. So there's many institutional and practical steps that would be needed. And I think generally with the digital agenda, there's as Apar mentioned, there's a huge share of the society that is still not connected or not connected in equality as others, and also even the majority, I think, of us is very uneducated in a sense of, how technology really works and impacts us. So we also need simply a lot of investment into making people understand how systems work, because I think that's the basis of the whole story, to simply understand the world and the technologies that impact your life.
Thanks. I want to shift gears at that moment and talk a bit more, like look into the future. So let's imagine 2040, 20 years from now, what, if you're sketching out a positive future for your field, what would this look like? What rights would it entail? You've already been touching upon some topics, but what would this future look like? And what are the essential rights that people need in order to thrive in this world? Maybe let's start with, who wants to start? Shandor.
That's a tough question, because I think the whole digital world is developing so quickly that I have no clue how things will look like in terms of digital in 20 years. But what I would really like to see, and what my personal interest here is the question of the governance of internet and technology platforms. So simply the question of democracy, how it can be extended to the digital sphere, how there is a kind of global governance on what works and what doesn't, what laws regulate the internet, and this is well set. And I think we are so much lagging behind. We're having a democracy that is, designed, 50, 70 years ago, and we struggle with, reforming it, while, we have this extreme pressure from the digital world especially platforms, to control them and allow people having a say about the use of their data and so on. So I think my hope is that, we're gonna make big steps forward in this regard, and we won't be completely lagging behind always, technology companies, because I think what's really hard and disturbing now is that everything happens in a very reactive mode, and we as social actors, we have no chances to, or we don't really try to shape the future, but we constantly react to things that happening. And I hope that we catch up a bit in this regard. So I would to mention an example, I would find it very normal if I, let's say, would have a digital purse, an account where I would always see what kind of data that belong to me or that concern me are in whose possession, and I can give authority to someone to use it, or I can take it back. I can join people or I can join a group that shares our data or protects my digital rights and so on. One example, hopefully we're going to have it sooner than in 20 years.
Thanks. Apar, before you also answer to this question, since we started late to the audience, we're gonna extend the session to maybe 10 minutes, if that's okay for you as well, Apar. Do you have 10 more minutes to? Okay, great. So Apar, what do you envision the digital, but not only the digital future to look like, but the future in the field that you're working in? What should this future look like?
So Julia, I was thinking about this question also a lot in terms of futures thinking, and I came across this fascinating essay by Octavia Butler, and it's titled "A Few Rules for Predicting the Future." And just in terms of big picture thinking, I think it may help a lot of people who are Ashoka Fellows, as well as people who work in the non-profit sector. Just two lines I'll quote from her. She says, "Our tomorrow is the child of our today. Through thought and deed, we exert a great deal of influence over this child, even though we can't control it absolutely." So what she says is basically, we need to look at our past, we look at our present, where we're standing, and count on the surprises, because things will change, and sometimes we don't know how they'll change. We need to count for it. But if I see where we are sitting right now, digital technologies have a great degree of influence on the political systems of our world, on individuals as well as governments. And I think so, as we move towards much more threats towards democratic institutions, there's also the opportunity through these systems. Because at the end of the day, let's just look at the raw numbers. There's 600 million people in India or active internet connections. And these are people for the first time who are having the ability of participating in the media ecology. They've never had it. So how do we make sure that these people, millions of people who are coming online, get an opportunity of political participation, of ensuring small things? For instance, the roads outside their houses are built properly. They have clean drinking water. And I think the internet may provide that promise, and it is providing that promise. In terms of much more futuristic, what will be the rights which will emerge? I keep going back to, very well understood values which are built on consensus in certain societies. And there's a great art exhibit by in which I forget, it's by essentially the preambles of about 30 countries are printed on scrolls, and they're juxtaposed with each other, which countries who have gone to wars together, and the values are contrasted against each other. And part of it is in Braille, because the artist is essentially posing that we are so blind to even the common values that we shared. And quite often it is a repetition of basic core understandings which emerged from the Second World War and through armed conflict across countries: justice, equality, fraternity, and a degree of liberty to achieve that. So I would say that the core articulations of the right will, of course, be developed alongside technology. For instance, with automated decision making, we just talked about it. With artificial intelligence, we'll talk about it. But I think the baselines will remain the same. The danger, again, what I'll point out is that technology as a framework of power may actually emulate existing frameworks of power, for instance, the monetary framework, and make inequality and either created or perpetuated. So we have a very good opportunity, in fact, because another powerful framework is being built of disrupting inequalities which have existed for long periods of time. But I think a lot of people will have to work together for that.
Yeah, and that's a good point that I wanted to touch upon, like the point of collaborations. Like when we started out, like our first touch points with the internet, and we were all young and the system was still very mature, and there was this kind of geeky environment. But these days, like the digital permeates every aspect of our lives, and in order to shift power, we need to collaborate with other civil society organizations around us that have like deep expertise in either health or environmental sectors. So with what organizations are you collaborating already, or what are your aspirations? Like with whom would you like to work on certain topics, stakeholders that are not native to like the digital rights space maybe?
So very quickly, we have worked with environmental campaigners. A lot of them happen to be people who are either young adults or teenagers. They have been campaigning around environmental protection dilutions using digital campaigning modes very effectively. For the first time, I've seen it happen in such an effective way. But also with groups, for instance, on contact tracing, application was made mandatory for people prior to joining the workforce. And it would have impacted people without smartphones, and a segment of our population doesn't have. So we've worked with labor unions to advance that. What we would like to aspirationally work with are also other underprivileged, underserved, discriminated communities across the gender sexuality spectrum as well as the caste spectrum. We've not been able to build out that work. There is an elite bias in digital rights work. And we hope to bridge that in future as well. One final thing, we have also recognized that we need to work very closely with the right to information community, which has done such incredible work globally. So they are quite often seemingly presented as people who would be opposed to privacy, but they understand the power argument instinctively. It's just that I think digital rights, as it's becoming flat, we need to actually also embrace and work with other organizations which have had a longer history working on specific sector areas.
Thanks. So freedom of information could already like be a topic that the two organizations, the two of your organizations could be working on in the future, maybe. Shandor, what collaborations do you currently have with organizations outside of your sector, or which collaborations do you aspire in the future?
So what I did not mention at the beginning is that we also launched Code for Hungary as because it came up from the need that we need to connect the technological sector and people in tech more to civil society. There's very little connection, and also we had a project which was a bit educating and working with other NGOs on how technology can actually help their work. And currently we're working on with an organization on a topic that is dealing with maternity care and the rights of women and moms especially. We did an online survey together with them, and it's very interesting and very important, I think, to do such collaborations with organizations that seems to be very distant from the field you're at, but you learn a lot about how actually they benefit or suffer from digital, and how let's say corruption is typically a topic that is very much present in the Hungarian healthcare sector. So technology and both this issue of corruption, I think, connects us, and we do, I think, very interesting work together. And I think in terms of wishful thinking, I would love to work more with media organizations, films, in order to, make those or allow those messages that we want to share to be shared to a broader audience and make it understandable to a much broader audience, because I think we often struggle with the fact that we have, let's say, a professional point of view or a legal point of view, but it often does not resonate with a wider constituency, and they simply are unaware of what's going on, why they, I think, could have really important contribution to discussions if you make this make the language understandable, and if you translate the issues into everyday normal language.
Thanks. I promised in the beginning of the session that we are also going to take questions from the audience. And here's a question in the chat, a very hands-on question. Why don't we have public online spaces that are as good as the commercial spaces online? Why are governments and nonprofit organizations not able to create these spaces? Will they ever exist? Apar, do you want to take a step?
We have email. Yeah, I think it works well. I think the government has, much more locally, it has announced certain programs, how it like to. Actually, there's also been a fair amount of literature that a lot of the innovation which has come out of Silicon Valley is not actually private. It's all public funded, in fact. Through the universities. So Margaret O'Mara's The Code actually posits that it's been partly military funding, partly university funding, but the ownership for some reason, yeah, I do acknowledge, has been centered within private and commercial interests. I don't know what's a good answer to this. Maybe we are not thinking about this well enough, but maybe there's a lack of a public funding outlay, or maybe the existing platforms are just too dominant for people to switch over at present. Whatever be the reasons, I think there is a need for greater public participation, or viewing even private platforms to a degree of regulatory oversight. And I think that understanding is at least coming through now, that if there are impacts through private platforms on public interests or individual liberties, there needs to be a regulatory framework to ensure that these harms don't occur.
Thanks. Do you want to add something, Chandra?
I think it's a great question, and I ask myself often about that. That at least it's probably easier to set up a cooperative farm with some other people who are in the same situation as you as a farmer than doing a cooperative social media platform, which is joined then by a lot of people. But I really hope that this will come. And I feel there's a great need for that. And especially because, or one reason for that is the fact that, the knowledge that is used to create a lot of private wealth and property, I mean, public education, let's say, and subsidies going into the sector and certain development are at the end exploited by, big companies and the big market, and it's very little that is then for the social benefit, and that has to change. And I think that needs to be supported in many ways, that the public sphere is much more present, also because some of these platforms have become like utilities. I mean, like heating and water, where you have at least certain rules in those countries where they're private, that you need to give access to people, and you need to comply with certain regulation. In many countries they're public goods, so not even privatized. And I think we need to move into this direction in the digital sphere, but being careful that governments are often authoritarian governments and dictatorships. So there's also a risk, I think, if there's too much or bad government place. I think, but the nice thing with internet and digital is that it can be completely public in a sense that it's based on us as citizens and not governments. And I think this is also a big chance for democracy and democratic control, that we are so many who have these needs. We would even not need governments to, oversee or own these platforms. I think citizens could do it as well, and I think Ashoka and social entrepreneurs can do really a lot to move this issue forward. I hope that this is going back to the question in where we're going to be in 20 years. I think here I hope we're going to make great progress.
Thank you. That was almost a good last line, but maybe over to Apar. What makes you hopeful for the years to come? Where do you draw inspiration from? You already shared that you are reading things by Octavia Butler. Where else do you draw inspiration from? Okay, I think we might have lost Apar. Oh, no.
I can hear you.
Okay, you're back.
Yeah, what makes me hopeful is just seeing a tremendous amount of opportunity and
okay, so
society which they didn't have earlier. So I think where we go from here is pretty much up to us, and we need to make sure it's in the right direction.
Thank you. Maybe a last statement from you, Shandor. What makes you hopeful, or what inspires you to continue your work?
I think in history, there's overall a progress happening if you look in the last centuries, but you have sometimes backdrops. And I think we have now this challenging time when we feel, things go in the wrong direction. But I believe that people are genuinely good. And at the end, we will benefit and learn from the mistakes and the problems we have. And we'll use our brains and opportunities to really improve life on this planet for many, and digital will help us on this way.
Thank you so much to the two of you for sharing things about your work, but also what you're hopeful for, and for opening up some visions that we can now think about after this session. And thanks also, Apar, for sharing the few rules of predicting the future. I'll read that after our call and also recommend it to the audience. There's one more thing I want to share before we close. For organizations in the audience who are working on digital topics and want to scale their impact, Ashoka has a collaboration with an organization called Tech to the Rescue, who are supporting civil society organizations in expanding their knowledge and also scaling their impact when it comes to using digital tools. If you are curious to find out more about this work, you can find the organization on the website totherescue.org. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our session. Thank you everyone for joining, and a special thanks to Shandor and Apar. And I'm looking forward to collaborations between Hungary and India in the future. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.